Now I have the great privilege of introducing someone who's been extraordinary when it comes to the environment. It's interesting, and those of you who are in politics might appreciate this. I'm a liberal. The former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney, is a conservative. But you know what? The environment is not a partisan issue. It should not be a partisan issue. We all share one planet, and we all want good jobs, and we all want to grow our economy, and we all want a more sustainable future for our children. And the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney was focused absolutely on that. I know he's extremely proud of his work on the environment. He considers it one of his greatest legacies, as do I. And it's extraordinary when you look at what he did. This was in the last decades of the 20th century. This was at a time when our country strived, as much as it does today, to be an international champion for justice and for peace, to support the developing world, to work together, to advance women's rights and also the rights of Indigenous peoples. And he also knew that we had to protect the only planet that we have. There's many examples that I could talk about. The former Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, negotiated the Acid Rain Treaty that was literally destroying our lakes in Canada, as well as in the United States. And he did this despite the intransigence of many others who were slow to move in addressing the problem. But here today, we're going to talk about the Montreal Protocol. And the former Prime Minister will talk about the history of the Montreal Protocol and how important it was. And I'm going to leave you with a quote in an article that he wrote, because I think this is what it's all about. We are aware. So he's talking about his wife Mila Mulroney. We are aware that the greatest legacy we leave our children and grandchildren is the earth, not only as a place we live, but also as a livable place. It is my great honor and pleasure to welcome the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney. Maintenant, joignez-vous à moi pour accueillir très chaleureusement le très honorable Monsieur Brian Mulroney.
Thank you, Madam Minister, very much. We're both Irish. So I had to remind her that when she invited me to be the keynote speaker, that the keynote speaker should always think of themselves as the body at an Irish wake. They need you in order to hold the party, but nobody really expects you to say very much. Yeah. So we'll try and deal with that, but before I do, I'm told that Elizabeth May, who's the leader of the Green Party in Canada and was my environmental advisor 30 years ago, is in the hall. And if she is, there she is in the back. Yeah. Welcome, Elizabeth. She played a major role in what we were able to do 30 years ago. So I'm delighted to see her and our other collaborators at the time. I'm honored and delighted to join you for this celebration of the 30th anniversary of the landmark Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, the only universal UN agreement ratified by 196 countries and the EU, more parties than any other international agreement in history. The Montreal Protocol was the result of prioritized and proactive leadership by Canada, the United States, some of the Nordic countries, and UN leadership of both the developed and developing world. From the perspective of my government, the environment was a priority from the first day we took office. We knew that we had to lead by example at home and engage the international community on environmental issues that knew no borders. At home, we proceeded rapidly to establish 8 new national parks, including, as Elizabeth will remember, South Moresby in British Columbia. And our Green Plan put Canada on the path to create 5 more by 1996 and 13 more by 2000. Dr. Mustafa Toba, when he was head of the UN Environmental Program, called Canada's Green Plan, and I quote, a model for the world. We began the long overdue cleanup of the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence River, the Fraser River, and we launched the Arctic Strategy to protect our largest and most important wilderness area in Canada's extraordinary and unending north. In Toronto, in 1988, Canada hosted the first international conference with politicians actively present on climate change. Gro Brundtland, such a marvelous leader she was, delivered a powerful keynote address, and Canada was the first Western country to endorse the historic recommendations of the Brundtland Commission, and the first, I'm proud to say, to embrace the language of sustainable development. In 1991, we signed the Acid Rain Accord with the United States, an issue that we had been working on since taking office in 1984. I want to come back briefly to acid rain as an important example of leadership and engagement. At the Rio Earth Summit in '92, we helped bring the U.S. on board. I visited with President Bush a number of times and strongly encouraged him to attend, which idea was being resisted by many leading figures in his administration and elsewhere. And we provided support for the Convention on Climate Change, and we were the first industrialized country in the world to sign the Biodiversity Accord Treaty. And then there was the Montreal Protocol, which a New York Times headline has called a little treaty that could. Could it ever, as it turns out. It has cut, as Catherine has just mentioned, the equivalent of more than 135 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions, while averting the collapse of the ozone layer and enabling its complete restoration by the middle of the century. Former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan has called the Montreal Protocol the most successful international agreement to date. The Economist last year called it the world's most lauded environmental treaty. And the New York Times reported in 2013 that the Montreal Protocol is widely seen as the most successful global environmental treaty. In The Guardian, Mario Molina, the Nobel co-laureate in chemistry for his work on the ozone depletion, wrote that the Montreal Protocol has a claim to be one of the most successful treaties of any kind in the world. Professor Molina continued, the same chemicals that attack the ozone layer also warmed the climate. Thus, in phasing them out, the Montreal Protocol has made a large contribution as well to protecting the world's climate. The Montreal Protocol is therefore a unique planet-saving agreement. How did we get to Montreal? And how did we get this protocol? And how and why has it been such an unqualified success? It's a long story that begins with the scholarly work on ozone depletion in the 70s, which led to the March '85 Vienna Convention, following 2 long, arduous years of international talks by governmental officials. To take talks to the treaty level, another round would be required, and the Austrians suggested that Canada should be the host nation in recognition of its role in achieving the Vienna Convention and strides made to create the needed regulatory provisions. And then in May of 1985, British scientists made the stunning announcement that a hole in the ozone had appeared over Antarctica. In other words, there was literally a hole in the sky. As the New York Times reported 4 years ago, the news caught the public imagination in a way few discoveries do. The truth of the matter is that it scared the hell out of anybody with a brain in his head. And that applied to all governments, except mine, of course, which was perfect. People everywhere understood that if the Earth was our home, there was a hole in the roof of our house. While ozone depletion had been stopped, the hole in the sky is still 7.6 million square miles, twice the size of Canada. And Canada has the second largest landmass in the entire world, following only Russia. So this is not a tiny thing. The good news is, as the Washington Post headline recently reported, the Earth's ozone hole is shrinking and is the smallest it has been since 1988. Originally, the Montreal Protocol was to reduce CFCs by 50% by 1999. Later, it was agreed that all CFC production would cease by 2000. The Montreal Protocol actually set a new standard for an international treaty. As our lead negotiator, Victor Buxton, later wrote in a review of the Montreal Protocol's distinctive features, it put in place an international process for controlling all ozone layer depleting substances. It did this by providing both a short and a long-term plan in addressing ozone depleting substances. It provided a mandated phase down which stimulated product development for environmentally acceptable substitutes or alternatives in all of the chemical products, for example, that were affecting our decisions. It signaled to all producers of these controlled substances that society's tolerance of these chemicals would be short-lived and future investment decisions should be made accordingly. It put in place a dynamic science and technology-driven process whereby the stringency and scope of the controls can be adjusted in response to the current understanding of the science. It provided within its own framework a very important provision, an incentive for developing countries to join the protocol without fear of going broke, without fear of additional economic hardship for having done so. And it provided for trade sanctions as a way of denying those who chose to remain non-parties access. It deprived them of access to the world's most lucrative markets. The inclusive framework meant that rather than limiting the Montreal Protocol to the 30-odd countries that made ODSs, everyone in the world came on board. With 191 nations at the time, and I think, Madam Minister, 197 today. And industry, which had been a big part of the problem, became an important part of the solution. I'd like to cite the example of DuPont, then the world's largest manufacturer of CFCs. DuPont responded to the challenge by transitioning out of CFCs and creating innovative technologies that not only made the company a good corporate citizen, but also increased its profits. It became green in more than one way. As Professor Molina has observed, the treaty aimed at starting, then strengthening action. And success has continued to breed more success. Over 3 decades, it has reduced nearly 100 ozone-depleting chemicals by nearly 100%. The ozone layer is healing and is likely to recover in several decades, he said. The 30th anniversary of the Montreal Protocol provides countries around the globe with an historic opportunity that you are in the process of seizing, to which the Minister has made reference, of the very important Kigali Amendment that would further reduce GHG emissions by 80%. This is a major achievement, and I salute the Minister of the Environment and all of you from your respective countries who have played a leadership role in such a major addition and enhancement of the